Yeah, first off, thank you very much for attending this SEASSI lecture series. I am very happy to introduce you to my advisor, Dr. Nam Si Kim. He is one of the leading researchers in Vietnam, and he specializes in archaeology. Um, one of his educational background, he first received his bachelor's from the University of Pennsylvania, and his MA in political science in New York University, and continued on to receive both of his master's and PhD in the University of Illinois at Chicago. He's basically interested in researching the archaeology of East and Southeast Asia, specializing in the development of social political complexity and urbanism and state formation. His main research is Co Loa, which he will be talking about today. Dr. Kim has published a lot of articles, but his most famous book publication is publishing on the origin of Vietnam and the emergent warfare. Dr. Nam Kim has received a lot of numerous support for his work, including research grant from the University of Wisconsin, a number of Henry Luce Fellowship Foundation grants. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Nam, Dr. Nam Si Kim. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. And thanks very much, Lisi, Jinda, and Dr. Mike, and everyone at the center. It's a privilege to be here, and I wish we were in person. Unfortunately, we're doing this on Zoom, but hopefully you'll enjoy the journey we're going to be taking today. So as Richard pointed out, I am going to be talking about the site of Co Loa located in Vietnam, and it's sort of its larger context culturally and historically, and some of the ongoing field work that we've been doing there, my colleagues and I. On the screen, there is an image showing some of the kinds of festivals that occur regularly at Co Loa, and it gives you kind of an idea about the cultural significance of the site and of its history. There are legendary accounts that are tied to the site and to its culture history. There are artifacts and sites that have come up over the years that can be connected to these accounts. And I'll be talking about all of this today. So to give you just a sort of setting for what we're going to be discussing, some chronological and geographic background. Obviously, we're on a different part of the world here, but I have this here to give you a little bit of an analogy. So if we think about the Eurasian landmass on the western side of it, when we think about the Mediterranean area and the Roman Empire, this would be the last couple centuries BCE, right on the eve of the imperial period. So this is not too far from the time of the Ides of March and Julius Caesar. We see the eve of the imperial period for the Roman Empire. And what's interesting with this period is we have evidence from texts as well as from archaeology about how the Romans moved through this region and viewed people, different populations, different societies within this region. And what we can tell is that many of their perspectives had to do with those on the fringes. So those that were not citizens of Rome or who didn't speak Latin were viewed as the other, right? In some ways as barbarians living on the fringes of the Roman world. So areas of modern day France, Belgium, Germany, and so forth, where we have the Celts and the Gauls and others, were considered to be the uncivilized. Now, if you move across that landmass going eastward, you get to these areas closer to the Pacific Ocean. And on the other side, we see parts of East and Southeast Asia. And in particular, I want to point to this area. So this would be modern day China. And that little bit of darker red is what we call the central plains of this region. And here we have emerging in the central plains right around the same time period, maybe a couple centuries before, this imperial power that starts to form as well. So some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this Warring States period history. We have during the first millennium BCE, various kingdoms that were competing for political power and control over the central plains and surrounding regions. And at some point, right around the 3rd century BCE, one of them, the Qin dynasty, begins to take over and consolidate power over the Central Plains. One of the most notable archaeological sites related to the Qin would be the very famous mausoleum for Qin Shi Huangdi. So this is the thousands of terracotta soldiers that were interred within the mausoleum. And this kicks off what's known as the imperial period of China. So Chinese empires begin at this point in time. Not long after his death, he's interred into this mausoleum. The Han Empire then takes over. And we know that the Han begin to expand even further outside of the Central Plains, moving into the so-called barbarian world. And this includes the area that we're going to be talking about today. So as they move southward into the domain of the southern barbarians, they begin to reach areas of what would be modern day northern Vietnam. And the Sinitic chroniclers and administrators, as they move into these areas, they describe the kinds of populations that they encounter. The historian of the Han court, Sima Qian, described some of the lifeways and people that were encountered, talking about, as no surprise here again, the barbarians that live in these outer areas, who were, quote unquote, in need of being civilized. So this is the sort of backdrop that we can point to. And of course, a couple thousand years ago, there was no Vietnam and there was no China as we know them today. But we have the sort of embryonic elements that lead to these civilizations. And one of the things that is interesting, especially when we think about the proximity between these two societies, groups of societies, is the very complex relationship that begins to emerge. The roots go very far back, even before the time period that we're discussing. But when we think about proto-Vietnamese civilization, something like 2,000 years ago, one of the important things to remember is that event. So when the Han Empire expands southward and annexes northern Vietnam, what we would see as the Red River area, this kicks off what's known as the Sinitic domination periods. So various Chinese dynasties would come into power over the centuries, but essentially they would continue to control more or less this northern part of Vietnam. And it wasn't until the 10th century that we see independence. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later on. This is important as a sort of historical backdrop for everything that we're going to be talking about today. In fact, if we look just a few years ago, the sociologist Dung Lai talked about in an op-ed in the New York Times some present-day concerns regarding the modern-day country of Vietnam and alliance building in geopolitics and so forth. But there's one particular quote that we can look at from that op-ed that gives us an idea. It encapsulates this very complex relationship. The Vietnamese have fought for thousands of years, right, to maintain their culture and independence in the shadow of a giant neighbor. And of course, that giant neighbor is to the north, is China. This is a tapestry that is in the Reunification Palace, Independence Palace. It's located in Ho Chi Minh City. Ho Chi Minh City, of course, was Saigon before the end of the what we know as the Vietnam War in the US. And in 1975, we have the end of the conflict and reunification. Hanging in that building is this artwork that shows the Van Long Kingdom. The Van Long is part of this sort of legendary history of Vietnam. According to some textual accounts and chronicles, these are the sorts of ancestors or founders of Vietnam. And they're widely viewed and invoked as this sort of legendary kind of source of the Vietnamese people. We know even in the 1940s, at the heels of World War II, when the Japanese were defeated, when the French tried to regain control of the country, and of French Indochina, we know that they had their colonies there. Ho Chi Minh, who actually visited many archaeological sites, even during war, gave a Declaration of Independence speech in 1945, hours after the defeat of the Japanese. And in his speech, he invokes these meta-narratives, these legendary accounts. He mentions the legends of the kingdoms that existed. And gives us some idea that there is a connection through time, right? From that time period over 2 to 3,000 years ago, right up until the present, to the 20th century, there is a sort of connection for the Vietnamese people and their history. This tells us just how significant culture and history are intertwined with modern day conceptions and identity and politics. So that's the sort of backdrop that I wanted to give as we start to get into this story of Vietnam, of early quote unquote Vietnam. Some of you may, I'm sure, know this already, but I have mixed ancestry. From my name, you can probably tell I have Korean ancestry because of the Kim, which is basically like Smith in Korea. But I'm also part Vietnamese, and I was born in Vietnam. So this is actually me with my mother in 1975. That's April 29th in 1975, the day before Saigon was taken by North Vietnam. And my parents and I evacuated by helicopter off the rooftop of one of these buildings in Saigon. And we were refugees moving through the Pacific Ocean, eventually ending up in the United States. So I tell this because there is a personal connection for me between my background and the work that I'm doing in Vietnamese history. So my mother, who grew up in Saigon, her family hailed from the north, closer to the Red River Valley that we're going to be talking about. And in that area, this is a picture of her and her clan, her family from the 1950s in Ninh Binh. I think she's standing right here, if you can see my arrow. So I think she's about 6 years old there or so. She and my uncles and my relatives, when they were growing up, they heard some of these stories that we're going to be talking about today. Some of the legendary accounts were being taught as part of historical knowledge, as accepted conventional wisdom within schools. And many of these stories, when they talk about the constructions and the emergence of Vietnam, they focus on the geographic area of the north. So this is in the Red River Delta and Valley area. This is known as Bac Bo in Vietnam. For many people in that country, in Vietnam, that's the embryonic nucleus, the crucible for Vietnamese civilization up there in the north. And what we understand, of course, of Vietnam today is very different from Vietnam, or the idea of Vietnam a couple thousand years ago. The areas of central Vietnam and southern Vietnam were added to the modern day country only in the last several centuries or so. So really, we're talking about the north when it comes to the crucible. And what we know about that history for that time period before the Sinitic domination periods, that knowledge comes to us from a few different sources of information. They talk about these legendary kingdoms. We have oral traditions. We have folk tales. We also have, increasingly, more and more archaeological data, giving us some ideas. In particular, for that part of the world, we're going to be looking at what's known as the Dung Sun Culture, as well as at the Co Loa site that we're going to be talking about as well. This is an image from an excavation Haiphong. This is the Viet Cave burial site. It's a famous burial site because it's part of the Dung Sun culture. It was a boat burial. The Dung Sun were renowned for a few different things, including bronze working, including the use of boats. And this particular burial, I think it's M2, tomb number 2, was excavated in 1961. There were over 100 artifacts. It's one of the richest Dung Sun boat burials that has been uncovered. Out of those artifacts, the vast majority were valuable bronzes. And here's a sort of artistic rendering of what that burial might have looked like. And here are some of the examples of bronzes, opulent materials that came out of that burial. Somebody of very high status was interred in that boat burial. But you can see ceremonial vessels, you can see utilitarian tools, spears, axes, blades. You can also see instruments like this bronze drum, okay, fragments of the bronze drum. This site has been made a national relic or national site of significance by the Prime Minister. I think this was just about maybe 8 years ago or so. But the Dung Sun culture is one of the famous archaeological cultures that the Vietnamese point to when we talk about embryonic Vietnam, proto-Vietnamese civilization. So this would be what's known as the late Bronze Age or early Iron Age. This is the first millennium BCE. It's all throughout that northern part, that Red River Valley. And we have information from this mostly from archaeology, because the people that were the bearers of this material culture, they didn't write anything. They didn't leave those kinds of records for us to be able to decipher. Instead, we have their remains of their lifeways. So various artifacts and sites. We know that they were growing wet rice. They were socially complex. There's evidence of social stratification and ranking. Most of the sites we know about come from burials or cemeteries. There's some evidence of workshops and residences as well. But what's also clear is the bronze working, very sophisticated bronze development. And on some of these bronzes, we have depictions, iconography, giving us clues about lifeways as well. And you can see some of these examples here. You can kind of make out the iconography with depictions of individuals, of ceremonies, of boats, of warriors. And of course, the iconic symbol of the Dung Sun culture is the drum. These bronze drums from this photograph are in the National Museum. And in the background, you can see some of the motifs that were rendered onto the bronzes. This particular bronze drum, this was on the cover, the title slide. This is a drum that was found at Co Loa back in the 1980s. Some farmers discovered it by accident. I think it was 1981. This is one of the finest specimens of bronze drums that have been found in northern Vietnam and maybe anywhere within East and Southeast Asia. So the Co Loa drum is about 160 pounds. People estimate that 1,000 to 7,000 kilograms of crude ore material would have been necessary just to produce this specimen. That's a lot of wealth. That's a lot of material. And it's a lot of specialized knowledge that's attached to that. And of course, you can think about the craftsmanship that's associated with the decorative elements. If you look at the tympanum, for instance, you can see just how intricate some of these designs are. And what I have here, I want to point out a couple of things. If you look at that band going in that circle, you can see individuals with their feathered plumed headdresses. You can see on the outer band what looks like birds, right? These are crane motifs. For those of you that have been to Vietnam, maybe you've been to the city of Thanh Hoa, and this is what you encounter when you're driving through the highway coming into the city. You can see this massive modern day monument. In the center of that photograph is a replica of a drum, and then you have the cranes on the sides ringed around that. So you can see these motifs in monuments today. You can see these motifs on postcards. You can see them on tea boxes. This is very significant because it is the last culture, prehistoric culture, archaeological culture, before the Han come in, before they come into the picture. And according to textual accounts, they come in and annex or begin their consolidation process at around 111 BCE. That's the ascribed date. Okay. So here's the region once again, just to give us some backdrop. There is the Red River. If you can see my cursor, it starts up here in the Yunnan Plateau of modern day China, the southwestern part of China. It comes down through the mountains about 1,200 kilometers before reaching the Gulf of Bac Bo, also known as the Gulf of Tonkin. And the site of Co Loa is located right there. So right outside of Hanoi. Here is another image. If we zoom in, there you've got the city of Hanoi. This is the modern capital. In the little circle, you have the Tung Long Citadel. Some of you are familiar with that particular site. That was the capital during the second millennium, so over the last several centuries. And this is a game I like to play with students. Can you spot the archaeological site? Of course, if you were in the room with me, you could point to it. Maybe you would be able to guess, but I'll show it to you right here. That's it. So that's Co Loa. What I love about this photograph is the juxtaposition. You have this very significant Red River that functioned as a thoroughfare of connection. And this is important. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But you can also see how this particular geographic space functioned as a locus of cultural and political power, right? So the capital of Vietnam or Vietnamese civilization, going back thousands of years, all in this particular location, right, on either side of that water. If we were meeting in person, we would be somewhere on this image. So I believe here's Camp Randall. That's the football stadium. If we were in Ingram Hall, I think we'd be somewhere around here. And this particular image to scale gives you an idea of the site of Co Loa to scale. So this is around the same scale. We're looking at a site that is 6 square kilometers in size, general size. About 450 of those hectares are enclosed. And that translates to about 1,100 football fields. For prehistoric Southeast Asia, this is one of the largest settlements that we can point to. I'm sure many of you are familiar with other urban centers and sites of Southeast Asia, places like Angkor, for instance. Those massive urban sites are much later in time. Right? We're talking about in the Common Era. This is one of the largest prehistoric settlements of Southeast Asia, prehistoric. So here's a satellite image showing the Co Loa site. And what you can see is that's readily visible would be a series of enclosures. This is the innermost wall. It's about 1.65 kilometers in its perimeter, and it's rectilinear in shape. It's punctuated by bastions. Then you have the middle wall, which is about 6.5 kilometers around, and then the outer wall, which is something like 8 kilometers around. Now, some of these areas still remain standing today, these walls, these ramparts. They're earthen materials. In some places, they still stand up to 10 meters high, maybe 30 meters wide at the base. They are flanked by outer moats or ditches. In the past, these moats would have been connected to the local river system and eventually to the Red River itself, that massive big river that we've been talking about. And today, much of this is now gone. We don't have access to the entire site. We don't have the entire system still in place. A lot of it has either eroded over the centuries, over the millennia, or they've had construction or development coming in. But if you look, for instance, right there, that's that middle or inner wall area, you can see the dense population. So the Co Loa commune is here, and there are thousands of residents in this area. So we have some access to the history, to the archaeological record, but we don't have a lot of access. And so we have to be very selective and creative and innovative in how we approach the field work to try to answer questions and test hypotheses. So if we zoom in, this is Co Loa on the ground, and you can see some of that modern day habitation, some of the architecture that has come up over the decades, going back over the centuries, and of course, going back over the millennia. Those ramparts I want to focus on here because a lot of the work that my colleagues and I have been doing over the last decade or so has been focused on the ramparts. Now, if you go to the site and you see them, they kind of blend into the environment. You might not even know you're looking at man-made artificial constructions. It's not until you start to really analyze that you figure out, well, these are actually artificial. And somebody put these constructions together. Now, there are ongoing debates about when this massive city begins to emerge and under what kinds of conditions, and of course, by whom? Who was responsible for putting all this together? Now, I hinted at some of those legendary accounts. This is a depiction, not of anybody from Vietnam, but from a different part of the world. I don't know if we have any fans of Monty Python in the call here, but this is a portrayal from Monty Python, The Holy Grail. The portrayal, of course, is of King Arthur. And King Arthur, as I'm sure everyone knows, has these accounts detailing his rise to power, his source of power being Excalibur, given to him by the Lady of the Lake, this sword. Excalibur and King Arthur and Arthurian tales have nothing to do with Go Loa. I want to make that clear. I have this here by way of analogy because some of the legendary accounts that we hear about from Vietnam are similar in sort of approach, right? So if we think about some of the tales that people tell about this period of time and about the founding of Go Loa and the kingdom that purportedly is responsible for its construction, there are tales about a man named An Zeng Vung, a king, who comes to power, starts a kingdom by the name of Au Lac during the 3rd century BCE, who has a magic turtle that comes out of the water, gives him advice about constructing his capital, about constructing his fortifications. The tales also describe how the turtle gives one of its claws to the king and advises him to use it as a trigger mechanism for a crossbow. The crossbow would then allow him to defeat all of his rivals, all of his enemies. These are the sorts of traditions that come to us. So this is one source of information. These folk tales and legends that come to us describing this period of time before the Han come in. So the Au Lac Kingdom and An Zeng Vung, who overthrew, I mentioned earlier, the Au Lac Kingdom. According to these legends, he comes in and overthrows the last of the Au Lac kings, establishes the Au Lac Kingdom, builds Go Loa. He uses it as his seat of power, as his capital. According to these tales, there were maybe 9 walls around in the shape, these sorts of spiral shape that is reminiscent of a snail shell. Now, we only saw 3 from those satellite images, but according to these tales, there were 9. The legend talks about the turtle giving aid to the king with constructions, with the advice for the city, with the trigger mechanism for the magic crossbow. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the romanticized tales regarding An Zeng Vung, how eventually he was tricked out of his crossbow. His daughter and her husband were able to somehow take the crossbow away. She did by accident, but that rival prince then gave it to his father, who was a rival king, and this led to the downfall of the Au Lac. So there are these romantic tales. And if you look at textbooks, they talk about these histories. They talk about these tales. And as I mentioned before, my family members and relatives grew up reading about this. And this was part of conventional wisdom. This was taught in school books and textbooks. You can see it commemorated today. In fact, I was able to come across a video game recently where you can choose to be the king, An Zeng Vung. He wields this crossbow. So it's part of the national imagination. It's part of popular culture. So that's one source of information. Folks have pointed out that maybe we can accept it as conventional wisdom, but maybe there are problematic aspects to that source as well. Historians, for instance, point out the fact that many of these tales, although they may be oral traditions that date back to the time that they describe, they weren't officially written down until many centuries later. Something like the quote-unquote medieval period of Vietnam. So 14th, 15th century, some of these textual accounts after the Vietnamese regain independence, after the domination periods are over, then you see Vietnamese dynasties coming along and then documenting these stories. And according to some arguments, maybe they embellished, maybe they added elements. And so there might be political motivations for some of those details. There might be elements of the supernatural that are mixed in. So because of these kinds of considerations, it's difficult to accept all of that information wholesale and say that it's 100% valid or accurate. So there are some problematic aspects to point to. The other source of information, of course, as we mentioned, would be some of the chronicles written by Sinitic folks who are coming into this area. So once the annexation begins, even before or slightly after, we have historians from the chronicles of the Han court, for instance, writing about what they encounter, whom they encounter. And of course, they are talking about some of the barbarians to the south who had to be civilized, right? This is the typical colonizers trope. So I'm sure you can see analogies here with colonial events that happened in more recent times. Of course, the Romans wrote about the barbarians around them. The Han talked about the barbarians that needed to be civilized. So this was a justification for the annexation, for the invasion, and for changes that would begin to happen. So you have these different kinds of viewpoints. And of course, we have to take some of those chronicles with a grain of salt as well. Right? How accurate would all of those details be? Is there some kind of imperial bias that might be at play here as well? Maybe some ethnocentric kinds of thinking. So you can see that there are problems with either kind of account, but you have this juxtaposition on either end of this kind of spectrum of depictions about what life was like just over 2,000 years ago in this part of the world. And if we wanted to sum it up in a kind of nutshell, you could say that the civilization, as it begins to emerge here, proto-Vietnamese civilization, either it comes about through local indigenous processes, or it's imposed by a foreign power, in this case, the Chinese. So those are the two models that we can generally talk about. And of course, the third possibility is that maybe there's some element of validity to both sides of this story. What I would submit, and what my colleagues and I have been operating under the assumption of, is that archaeological information is crucial to try to resolve some of these debates. And in particular, the one question that we can try to address is the city of Co Loa. Is it a byproduct of the Han Empire? Or is it something that's local and indigenous? Right? What can archaeology say about this? So this is where the archaeology and the fieldwork come in. My colleagues at the Institute of Archaeology based in Hanoi, this is a national outfit. The Institute of Archaeology is part of the Vietnamese Academy of Social Sciences. And the archaeologists at the Institute in Hanoi and I have been working together, going back some 15 years or so now, collaborating on investigations at the site of Co Loa. And some of the questions that we've been trying to answer have to do with the ones that we just outlined. When does the city begin to emerge? And who might be responsible? So as I mentioned earlier, we don't have access to the entire city because of modern day habitation, because it's a massive site and we have limited resources, so we have to be very targeted in what we do. But one thought as we started our field work, our collaborations, was to use the walls as a proxy to determine when the city begins to emerge. If you can talk about when the monumentality begins to emerge, that is a proxy measure for when the city begins to emerge. So we looked at the wall system and we began to investigate. So in 2007, we did our very first excavation. This was at the middle wall at the north gate. Then in 2012, we excavated a portion of the outer wall. And then in 2014, the innermost wall, that rectangular, rectilinear construction. So the very first project was the first time that a team composed of American and Vietnamese archaeologists worked on this, excavated at Co Loa. And this actually represented one of the very first systematic investigations of the rampart system. There had been some impromptu earlier investigations when people had cut roads through some of the walls as they were building or building gardens. They would just clear away some of the profile and give some kind of report about what they saw. But this was the first systematic excavation that we embarked on. And we have data that came to us about the construction methods, about some of the artifacts, and of course, giving us clues about chronology. So I'm going to talk mostly about the middle wall excavation. And as a sort of example, we have at that particular location at the north gate, the wall was about 4.5 meters in height and maybe something like 26 meters wide at the base. And on either face, exterior and interior face of that wall, we have tiered or stepped levels. And you can see from the photographs the kind of scale that we're talking about. Here are profile images of the excavation trenches. We put a 5-meter wide trench through from the apex of the wall down through sterile soil. And we excavated the outer ditch, suspected area of the ditch or moat on the outside of the wall as well. So I won't go into all the details. I'll be happy to answer questions later if you have questions about them. But in general, we were able to identify different chronological periods. So we can call them early, middle, and late. And within those, we have various phases of construction. The period of interest for us comes from the middle period, so phases 2, 3, and 4, where we have artifacts, we have profiles that give us ideas about construction methods, and we have organic materials as well that are able to yield radiocarbon dates, and dates also come to us from thermoluminescence analysis of some of the ceramic materials. But that middle period is the one that we are going to be focusing on today. Just below that middle period, we uncovered artifacts of the Dung Sun culture. So remember, I mentioned the Dung Sun culture earlier, something like 100 different sites all over northern Vietnam. These pieces of pottery fragments are a diagnostic of the Dung Sun culture. So we know that Dung Sun community members were in this area. Some of the earliest levels show pottery from the Dung Sun culture. You can see some of the images of the fragments in situ, and then radiocarbon dates from charcoal that was found in conjunction with those fragments. They come back to us in this window of about 500 to 300 BCE. This is calibrated. And it gives us an idea that before the wall was constructed, there were Dung Sun community members living in this area. Next, we have then phases 2, 3, and 4. This is that middle period. And you can see from the profile the construction layers. Different techniques are being used here, and you can also make out clumps of material, soil and clay, that are being dug out, presumably from the ditch area just outside, dug up and flipped upside down, right? So what we see here in terms of stratigraphy is the actual upside down version of what we see with the moat excavation of the sterile soil down there. But what's interesting here is we have in the early phase just piles of earth, clay materials being dumped into this mound-like feature. Then we start to see thick versions of rammed earth, stamped or rammed earth, which is significant because some of you may know this, and I'm happy to talk more about this later. Stamped earth is a method of construction for foundations of buildings, for walls, that have roots in China, ancient China, going back to the Neolithic period, a couple of thousand years even before this time period. So it's interesting to see this here. And then we have very thin layers of rammed earth, but also fragments of roof tiles. And this is in that phase 4 area. Now, in addition to those layers and construction methods and some of the fragments of materials, we also uncovered charcoal. So organic materials stratify throughout these layers. And those were analyzed and give us a window of something like 300 to 100 BCE. So you have the Dung Sun period and those features underneath, 500 to 300. Then you have 300 to 100 for the bulk of the rampart construction. At the top, where we have those roof tile fragments, those were some of the artifacts that we first started to see. We can say something about the roof tiles. They are everywhere. So if you, not just at the middle wall, but if you go along the perimeter for the outer or inner wall, at around the same depth from the surface, you have evidence of these roof tiles. And we had uncovered in this location thousands of fragments of roof tiles. Excuse me for a second. What they're doing here is debatable. So perhaps there was a roof. Maybe this is stabilization against erosion because of monsoonal rains. We're not sure. We didn't find any post holes, but we did find charcoal, and the charcoal comes back to us with those dates. So sometime around the period of around 2 to 100 BCE, we start seeing these roof tiles being deposited. And what's interesting about them is that we only find them at Co Loa at this time. There are no roof tiles found anywhere else in Vietnam until the Common Era. At this point in time, we only see it at this settlement. We don't see it at other Dung Sun sites anywhere else. It suggests to us that perhaps the use of roof tiles is associated with this settlement as a capital or as some kind of royal or elite place. Not everyone is allowed to use the technology or to have that kind of infrastructure. The other thing to think about that's interesting is some of the excavations that my colleagues have done in that inner wall area uncovered casting facilities. And there are molds and other fragments of bronze casting, evidence of bronze casting. We also have then the bronze drum. And if you take this into consideration, the casting molds show us the production of bronze crossbow points, the bolts, being produced in a standardized, mass-produced kind of way. And we have evidence of the facilities. We also have evidence of crossbow triggers. This tells us a little bit about some of those elements. If you recall the story about the turtle and the magic that comes from its claw, right, as a trigger mechanism, that is consistent with some of the materials that we're finding. The bronze drum that was found not far from that rectangular inner wall area. And there are Vietnamese traditions that describe the ownership of these drums. Whoever is in possession of these drums would be a chief or a king. It is something of high symbolic value and wealth. Not everyone would have access to the materials, to the special skills that would be required to produce something like this. So those that would be very high in status. So if we take some of those materials and we think about the site, some of the data that come to us, incidentally, that middle wall, the data that we got from it was replicated. When we did the outer wall and the inner wall, we found roof tile fragments. We also had chronology and construction methods that were consistent, very consistent. So it tells us that it's likely the entire system of walls was constructed around the same time. Someone was responsible for planning all of that and for executing it. Not only putting it together, but then maintaining the walls over time. So you don't put something like that together if you thought there's no way we could maintain this indefinitely. It's a waste of effort if you were to do something like that. So there was an expectation that was likely in place. So there are some implications for all of this if we think about it. This photograph is a statue at the Co Loa site, and it commemorates an individual by the name of Au Loa. According to some of these textual accounts and these folk tales, he was one of the military advisors for An Giang Bung. Perhaps, maybe, a historical figure who knew something about tactics and military technologies in the crossbow, for instance. In any case, there may be some interesting connections between the myth of the turtle and this individual. I'll leave that for Q&A if you're interested in hearing more about that. But I want to talk about the implications then of the data. So when we think about what the site, what the materials can tell us, what does it say about An Giang Bung? What does it say about the Au Lac Kingdom? It depends on who you ask. For me, there are hints that strongly suggest the presence of something powerful here, that perhaps there is somebody by the name of An Giang Bung or somebody like that that existed. Perhaps there was a kingdom by the name of Au Lac that existed. But it's difficult to rule out every other possibility. So as an archaeologist who is open to various forms of data and interpretations, I can't rule out other scenarios. So I wouldn't go so far as to say this is definitive proof, but that's my personal opinion. Some of my colleagues disagree and say that it is proof, right? That it corroborates much of the other knowledge that they've already had in place. So the conventional wisdom tells us that if An Giang Bung is already described, and now we find the materials that support those elements that were in those folk tales, that's the proof that they need. So again, it depends on who you talk to and who you ask. What we can say definitively, and this is something that we all agree on, is something powerful was here. We know this. We can see the construction of those monumental walls. We can see the various kinds of production. So it's not just the bronzes, not just the weapons, but we have other kinds of materials, plows, showing us that wet rice agriculture on a very intensified scale was being perpetrated here to support a very large population. And we've done architectural energetic calculations to try to determine how much labor would have been necessary to produce those walls in the window of time that we have. And we're talking about thousands of people working in concert, being directed by some centralized kind of planning in order to do all this. So we're very comfortable, and I'm comfortable saying that we can talk about a state of some kind. And this is a name that we've given the Co Loa polity. So we don't know if Co Loa polity refers to Au Lac specifically. Maybe it refers to the kingdom that comes after, or some other power, some other kinds of polities. That I can't say for sure. But what I can say is some entity, a very powerful one, was in place before the Han arrived. That we can see. Not only that, but because of the continuous kinds of material culture that we see, going back to maybe 2000 BCE, we know people have been living here for 4,000 years continuously, from the Neolithic period through the Bronze Age, Iron Age, into the historic period. We can see elements of continuity in the archaeological record. I didn't have time to talk about all that, but we can see that in the material record. So there's continuous indigenous cultural history and change that's happening, leading to the emergence of this settlement. When you put all of this together, this idea of barbarians, I think, is untenable. So even though there are writers who talk about the uncivilized, the unsophisticated, the Han claimed that they had to bring sophisticated forms of government, of bronze working, of farming, and introduce that to these backwards, unsophisticated barbarians. We can say that civilization, in whatever form you want to call it, existed here that rivaled what we see elsewhere. So whether it's foreign imposition or indigenous development, the answer is probably both. And the reason I say this is because we do see local developments, but we also see it happening with connections. This is not happening in a vacuum. We know that there's exchange and trade that's happening all throughout this region. The archaeological materials tell us this. We can also point out the fact that the Warring States period was happening, as I mentioned earlier. So during the first millennium, the middle of the first millennium BCE, before the Qin dynasty consolidates power, the Warring States is probably, that period is probably forcing and displacing migrants. There's a lot of flux. And maybe some of those migrants are coming southward to escape turmoil. Maybe they're bringing knowledge with them, cultural practices with them. This gives us some clues about why we start to see some of those roof tiles here, because we know roof tiles were being used for centuries before that in parts of China. They don't originate in Vietnam, but they're being appropriated potentially. That and other kinds of technologies like the stamped earth, rammed earth methods of building. So that gives us some ideas about the notions of barbarians and so forth. And I want to talk a little bit about the ongoing work that we're doing. So this is, Richard has been to Vietnam. He's been in the field with me. He knows what it's like to do archaeology and the use of mobile offices around Co Loa. On the screen, we have my colleague, Ching Hong Hiep and Russ Quick. And in the last few years, we've been doing remote sensing at the site. So in addition to the excavations that we had been doing, we are now trying to do geophysical surveys because, as I mentioned, we don't have access to the entire site and we have limited resources. You can't dig up the entire settlement. What you can do is geophysical methods to find anomalies under the surface to give you ideas of where you might want to excavate and target your resources. So this is one location I just want to briefly mention. This is location 12. This is a rice paddy field. Now on the left, you can see my colleague, Dr. Russ Quick, walking back and forth with the magnetometer. So as he does these transects, the imagery comes up and shows us if there are anomalies under the surface. So the magnetometry will tell us if there might be sites or features, burned material, bronzes, metal underneath the surface. So anomalies that we might want to investigate. And I want to point your attention to these two rectangles here. There are anomalies in these green ovals, and we dug test trenches in these two rectangles. And this is what came up. The magnetometry had never been tried at Co Loa before. And we wanted to test the method and to show our colleagues a proof of concept, essentially. So we said, let's see what the results tell us, and then let's do some test excavations, what we call ground truthing. And these are burial sites. You can see burial goods coming up. The human remains are no longer there because of the acidity of the soils. But these particular trenches are from what's known as the Lei Dynasty. This is 18th century. We suspect that there may be more in that location. The other anomalies may be part of a larger cemetery. But we have this here giving us an idea that the method works. So we might not know the time period or the kind of materials that will be underneath the surface, but we know something is there, right? We can identify that. Beyond that, we have increasingly access to LiDAR imagery. Some of you may be familiar with LiDAR. It is revolutionizing what we know and what we can do in terms of remote sensing and archaeology. This is LiDAR imagery for Co Loa, and I would just want to point your attention to the lower left area. And if you zoom in on that area, a couple things that come up become clear. In this box, we can make out these quadrants here. And those elevated areas tell us that perhaps we are looking at other walls. We can't see them from the satellite images and from aerial photographs, but the LiDAR makes them kind of clear. And it gives us ideas that perhaps there were other constructions here. So recall, I said earlier, the legends say there were 9 walls. We can see 3, but perhaps there were others that have been lost through time. And maybe we can make out the remnants of them using innovative geophysical methods like this. And so future fieldwork may be aimed at trying to identify other parts of the monumental system of constructions. I want to end just with a few images talking about the significance of Co Loa. So I mentioned earlier that ceremonies take place. There are annual festivals that happen that commemorate this history, the individuals such as Anzengbe. We know that there's an interpretive center, there's a museum on site. We have interests, there's national pride that's associated with the site. There's intellectual interests. We have researchers and visitors from overseas that come to visit. We know of domestic tourists that come to visit the site. Here are some images showing school children who come. They're given clay. They make models of the rampart walls. They're taught this history. It's very important. Here I have images of experiments reconstructing the crossbow technology. In addition to that, school children dressing up in suspected clothing from the era, and then being given the replicas, right, to do target practice with the crossbow. But you can see the elements of those legends, the elements of the archaeology and the material record, all being incorporated into modern day conceptions and identity. And it gives us an idea about how the past continues to live on, echoes through the generations. They're commemorated through rituals, they're commemorated through ceremonies. There's a purpose to this, right? If we think about how it instills a sense of community, how it instills identity, there is a power that's related to the archaeological record, to texts, to landscapes, right? That big image that we showed earlier, showing Hanoi and Co Loa and Thăng Long, right? This is a landscape that is culturally potent for people who identify as Vietnamese, who identify as these individuals as their ancestors. And there's an idea that the past then needs to be preserved, and it's a source of capital, cultural capital. There's an episode that's important to think about here, and I want to end on that. If we think about commemoration and memory through the centuries, I mentioned that there was the Sinitic domination periods during the first millennium of the Common Era. At the 10th century, the year 938, some of you know this history, there was a very famous battle that takes place at the Bac Dang River, where Ngo Quyen, this Vietnamese general, he tries to fight off the Chinese, and he puts into the river mouth these spikes. So knowing the tides, he knew that if you can draw the Chinese Navy into that river, the mouth of the river, when the tide goes down, the spikes would then upend some of their ships. And this is how he was able to defeat them and gain independence. So that history is commemorated. What happens right after he wins is that he proclaims himself the king of Vietnam in the 10th century. So this kicks off the independence, regaining of independence. And he chooses as his capital the Co Loa site. He goes across the river. He moves the capital away from Hanoi and goes across the river back to the old Co Loa area. We can hypothesize and theorize about why this happens. But one particular theory is that perhaps he's hearkening back to the old days, to the pre-Han days, and maybe saying that there is some legitimization that's happening here. I am the rightful ruler. My ancestors were the old Vietnamese kings. And that tells us about the importance of that historical period and of this particular site. And all the various stakeholders that have something to say about its preservation, about how its history is viewed, about how it's portrayed, how placards are written in museums, for instance, how textbooks are written. When we were doing our excavations, we were visited constantly by researchers, by tourists, by local community members, by national figures, the former president of Vietnam, the deputy prime minister, all coming to visit because everybody was interested. Everybody had a stake in what was going to be coming out of the ground, how it might change or support history as they knew it. And I think this underscores the importance of the site, and it gives us a very clear illustration about how the past and the present are connected. Okay. With that, I'll end, and I'd be happy to stick around and answer any questions anybody might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kim, for that lecture. And now, as you mentioned, we do have time for questions. So you can feel free to type them in the chat, raise your hand, and I will be unmuting all participants, so you should be able to unmute yourself as well.
So Lisi, should I stop sharing the screen?
Sure, yeah, that'd be fine. So we can just see each other and then share again if there's a question on a slide.
Okay.
Okay, we have a question. If you want to ask it directly, you can. Otherwise, I will read this.
Okay, my name shows up in Korean. Sorry about that, but you can refer me as Matthew Park. I'm actually curious about the functions of the multi-layered walls in Co Loa because I believe that it must have served some defensive purposes given its significant height and whatnot, and the fact that it was, of course, like rebuilt multiple times. So was it meant to protect against anything? Because I mean, I think with the chronology that you mentioned, I think it was before Han conquest. So it must have been probably, and you also said there was relationship with the Chinese side even before that. So maybe there were maybe intermittent conflicts and battles that did exist before recorded history of the major war, or it was some other outsider, other ethnicities or other polities that they were facing against.
Yes, thank you, Matthew. Right, I think I can read. Is it Sungun?
Correct, very correct.
Okay,
thank you.
Yeah, that's an excellent question or series of questions. So what I can say is there are different interpretations for the functions of the walls. I've heard people say maybe they were constructed for flood control, maybe they were there to just keep animals in, maybe they were there for agricultural purposes, for irrigation. But for me, I do think that defense and fortification, military functions, would have been extremely important, and perhaps maybe the primary reason that they were constructed. I would say that they're the only reason, but I would say that they maybe were one of the primary functions. And the reason I say this is for some of the reasons that you pointed out. If we think about the historical time period, the potential that threats were coming from outside or from other areas, there are a couple of things that we can point to. Some of the entrances appear to be baffled. And what I mean by that is they impede easy entrance and egress, right? Baffling tends to happen when you want to protect and fortify gates because those are the weakest points of enclosures. We can also see the presence of bumps with some of the ramparts. This is something that my colleagues and I have talked about. In some of these areas, the ramparts begin to go up and down. And you can say that, and our suspicion is that when the ramparts are built, the reason why they're sort of irregular in shape is because they were connecting hills. They were using the natural topography. That was a very expedient way to build the system. But when we see some of those rises, instead of just attributing that to natural terrain, what we noticed was that some of these bumps were about 80 to 90 meters apart, and they were spaced at regular intervals. So that suggests that this was constructed artificially. And if we think about the crossbow technologies, the effective firing range for the crossbow was something like maybe 50 meters, according to some of the experimental work. If you think about the functions of bastions, you want overlapping fields of fire. So those spaced bastions were ideal for the use of those technologies. So that tells us that perhaps that they were built as military installations, that the V-shaped ditches and all, I can go on, and I won't bore you with all the details. But the point is, we suspect that based on all that, based on the presence of weapons, and based on the iconography that we see, showing warriors, sometimes with captives during the Dung Sun period, warfare is definitely happening, and maybe the walls were built in this monumental fashion because the biggest threat could have been coming from the north. And that maybe somebody was anticipating that. And so you had all that investment in labor and materials and resources. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. It does. And I'm actually also curious about the irrigation and the agricultural connections that you made along with the labor, but I don't want to monopolize all the questions, so I'll leave it up to the rest of the floor and see if they come up with similar questions as well.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure. And I can come back to that. I'll just quickly say, I don't discount other purposes. Transportation, irrigation, and water control, flood control, all that would have been important as well. And I think there's no reason why these are mutually exclusive functions. I think they could have happened at the same time, and there could have been different uses over time as well, depending on what the needs were. Yeah.
All right, I'm next. Yeah, very nice presentation. Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to see it. I'm more interested about the god turtle. I've just learned in my Vietnamese class, I think yesterday or 2 days ago, about the rising of the turtle and him, the god turtle Kim Kui, giving the claw to An Yung Vung. So I want to know more about that. Is there an archaeological basis, or it's just part of the myth that they follow? And where did it come from?
That's a good question that I don't have a ready answer for. I don't know if anybody in the room knows more about it. From what I understand, some have theorized that the turtle is a representation of an individual, and that one of those statues I showed, Co Loa, was purportedly the military advisor or general for An Yung Vung. And there's a historian. Her name is Marilyn LaRue. She published an article in 2003, I think, talking about this. And she hypothesizes that perhaps the turtle is actually that advisor. That instead of the claw, so this is sort of a legendary figurative way of saying the claw was given to the king to make this magic crossbow, maybe the trigger mechanism was a military innovation. A bronze trigger mechanism was the innovation to improve the the efficiency of the crossbow as a weapon. And once you were able to do that and mass produce it, right? If this advisor showed this ruler how to do it, what to do, perhaps that's at the root of that power that was consolidated. That combined with knowledge of wall building, for instance. So I hinted at this before, the stamped earth. That's a construction method that goes back to maybe 2000 BCE or 3000 BCE in parts of the Central Plains in China. In fact, some of the earliest parts of the Great Wall of China, we know that the Great Wall was a bunch of smaller walls that eventually got connected together. some of those earliest walls were constructed using the same kinds of stamped earth technique. The soils were different, so the technique looks a little bit different here in this part of the world with Southeast Asia, monsoonal rains and clays and so forth. But that method could have come from the north, and knowledge of that method could have come from the north. So that turtle could be an actual individual, and maybe it's a metaphor, maybe it's a way to describe practices that come from the north. Maybe there are others in the room that know more about the sorts of figurative histories and the folktales.
No, thank you. That's a great answer. Appreciate it.
Sure.
I have also a question.
Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. I have more questions about the pottery that you found. Whether just maybe like primitive ceramics, or whether also like findings of glazed stonewares?
So they were not glazed stoneware. We found in later deposition levels, in the higher layers, evidence of stoneware from later time periods. But the earliest in that location that I showed, the middle wall excavation, we didn't find any of that. We found only the Dung Sun pottery, and then the ceramic roof tiles. But in the other locations, like the outer wall, for instance, some of the later stoneware kinds of ceramics were mixed in. So this indicates to us, at least, the suspicion that later societies came and refurbished, rebuilt on top. So the walls were there from earlier time periods, but later communities that came along, maybe during the 10th century and later, they refurbished and amplified. They built on top, maybe made the walls even bigger. And actually, this kind of dovetails with the first question that was asked. There's evidence that the fortifications were reused even centuries later. So maybe with Ngo Queen, but maybe much later than that. And I can talk about 20th century constructions that we saw related to 20th century conflict. That doesn't pertain to your question, but that's what we found with the middle wall, was the Dung Sun pottery mostly.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. As we're waiting for the next question, I can just say a little bit about that 20th century evidence. We found machine gun casings in our excavation. There was potentially a slit trench that was dug into the top of the wall that was probably from the 20th century. So maybe anti-aircraft installations being put in. I've written about this, but to me, it's fascinating because I do research war and the history of war and the origins of war, and to see a site like this of cultural significance experiencing conflict going through millennia, right up until the 20th century. Different societies, of course, very different cultures, but again, using the same space for fortification purposes, I think is quite astonishing.
Another
Do you wanna
question
go-
then, sorry.
Go ahead.
Do you think that the construction of the settlement took Chinese settlements as role models, maybe?
I think it's possible. The reason I say this is, well, there are two indicators. One is that inner wall, that rectilinear shape of it. We know with some of the predecessors and the peer settlements up in the north, many Chinese cities, ancient Chinese cities, going back to the Neolithic, used very similar kinds of principles for their constructions, for their urban environments. That and the use of the stamped earth, plus the presence of the roof tiles. So having those roof tiles, one suspicion before we were able to come up with chronology for the roof tiles is that maybe that inner wall and all of the walls were built after the Han came, right? Because we see elements of roof tiles in the north, but not in Vietnam. Because we have the chronology, it tells us that it was done locally and it was done before the Han annexation. But I think it's too much of a coincidence to say that it was completely independent. I think they appropriated, they knew about the use of roof tiles. they knew about the use of these kinds of roofing structures in Chinese capitals, royal cities. And maybe this was a way to say, this is a royal city here as well. It's our local stamp, right? We're going to have our own version of it, but we're using elements of authority, symbols of authority that we see from exotic locations. So I think that there is some influence. I don't think it's attributable completely to the North, but I think there are some forms of inspiration that do come from urban environments to the North.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I was just going to say maybe we could go back to Matthew's second question earlier. I didn't quite catch it. Matthew, what had you wanted to ask?
Oh, thank you. So it was about agriculture, and actually, it wasn't mentioned during the lecture, during the presentation, but I do believe that some earlier Semitic records about the Red River Delta and this region in specific deals with a specific type of agriculture that has to do with the rise and fall of tidal water. And since you mentioned agriculture, I was just wondering whether you found any evidence of water management or irrigation or a specific type of agriculture that might be attributed and that could be linked perhaps to this textual information, because I've been told that they do similar research in, say, Angkor, where the water management is very important, and you can actually see evidence of that from the water reservoirs and how it's a semi-aquatic or a riverine city, and if you've ever seen evidence of that happening.
Yeah, that's a very good observation. The simple answer is yes. So we know that wet rice was very important. And in this part of the world, whether it's at this time period or later time periods with Angkor, for instance, and we can see a long tradition of water management that was quite significant all throughout this region, throughout Southeast Asia, in fact. When we look at Southeast Asia as a whole, and we think about evidence of moated sites, settlements that you have outer moats that use the topography to control and manage water for irrigation purposes for wet rice production. There are hundreds of moated sites all throughout Southeast Asia during that first millennium BCE. Co Loa happens to be one of maybe the largest example of something like that, and something kind of like a hybrid between the urban sites that we see up north in parts of modern day China and some of these moated sites in Southeast Asia. But we know that it's important. And in fact, if you think about some of the materials, the boats, the coffins, the burials tell us that this is a very aquatic environment, that people were living in these environments and traveling through these waterways. We can see on iconography the use of the boats, but we can also see homes, structures, dwellings built on stilts. So they're raised above the floodplain. The floors are raised above. So people are living in these environments where they can farm and do wet rice agriculture, and also have their homes right in these areas. And this is something we see in Southeast Asia today still. So I think it speaks to the importance of the channeling and control of water for agricultural purposes. So exactly what you're talking about. I think it corroborates some of those textual descriptions that come up. And a lot of it probably is tied to the same kinds of practices that we see in parts of southern China. So the Yangtze, for instance, when we talk about the origins of wet rice production, the domestication of rice in that part of the world, there are parallels. So, a few thousand years ago, there was no China, no Vietnam, but there were many communities that were in contact with each other and sharing similar kinds of lifeways.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the answer. And in case I sound sleepy, that's because it's 6 a.m. here in Korea. And but you didn't bore me at all. I mean, this is what keeps me up at 5 a.m., 6 a.m. in Korea. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. I'm honored that you tuned in from that time zone.
We have time for a few more questions, which you can drop in the chat or ask directly.
Dr. Mike, the question.
Oh, thank you, Richard. So you mentioned southern China. I was already thinking about this. So as we know, the Han Dynasty is pretty far up north. And it's the one that comes after this period that spreads down and eventually conquers the northern part of what we today call Vietnam. But I'm interested in going back to the crossbow triggers and the roof tiles. So when you say these traditions, we didn't say it actually about the crossbow trigger, but the roof tiles, that they seem to have migrated. There seems to be a knowledge that has come down. But if you go to the coastal areas of southern China, which were, of course, themselves increasingly integrated into the Han Dynasty, do you go to, are there sites there along that coast or even in the interior of some of the river valleys where you can find evidence of these tiles, roof tiles, that are kind of moving their way down? Or do you find any evidence of this crossbow trigger that may have come from further north?
Right. I can speak to some of that.
Yeah.
So regarding the crossbow technology, there's clear evidence for that in use during the Warring States period before Co Loa. There's debate about where crossbows first come up, how they're innovated. Some argue that maybe it's a Southeast Asian innovation, that there are simpler versions. I won't go into those debates, but we know that in terms of the use of bronze and the innovations that are introduced with the trigger mechanisms, with the bolts themselves, with the points, trilobal heads, and so forth, we can see them. Even in the terracotta soldier, the tomb of Qin Shi Huangdi, we see evidence of crossbow mass produced, right? So that technology is in existence. Now, regarding the roof tiles, to your point, we do find evidence of capitals in parts of Fujian, of Guangdong, southeastern China. So not the Central Plains, but to the south. So other quote unquote southern barbarians. They're not quite the Han, but they're not Vietnamese either, right? But there's a sort of constellation of different ethnic groups, ethno-linguistic groups that existed in this area. They were also using roof tiles. So what's interesting to me is some of those roof tiles from some of those cities, we see similar kinds of motifs and elements. We also see writing, Sinitic writing on them. The roof tiles that we have from Co Loa, the end caps, we don't see any writing, at least from the examples that have been uncovered. Instead, we see motifs like a star shape or symbol, a sunburst. And that's very similar or reminiscent of the star shapes that we see on top of the drums, the bronze drum tympanum. This goes back to what I was saying earlier about the possibility that people are appropriating these trappings of Sinitic authority, and they're localizing it. So they're putting their own local stamp on things. They're taking, potentially, this is my theory, they're taking these elements of authority, use of roof tiles, and they're building their own versions of it, and they're putting their own local motifs on that. Instead of using the Chinese characters, they're putting symbols like the sunburst, which seems to be very local to this part of the world. We see some of the similar kinds of motifs in parts of southern China, Guangxi, for instance, on rock art. But it tells us that something was here before we have these accidents in history, before we have the modern day border of China and Vietnam. There were many different groups of people living in this region. We don't know who they all were. We don't know what languages they were all speaking. In fact, we don't even know what language the Dung Sun culture bearers were speaking. We have conjecture, but we don't know. But that I hope answers some of the questions you have about those roof tiles. Yeah, you're muted, I think.
Just a quick follow-up, because it's something that always amazes me about Vietnam, is that, like, because you kept sliding as your talk went on, it starts out as a talk about prehistory, sort of archaeology. But as the talk moves forward, you're actually talking about Vietnamese history. And it's like this goes back to my knowledge of knowing Carl Hutterer and some of the earlier,
right.
the whole way in which Vietnam sees this so-called prehistory, which goes way back further than anywhere else in Southeast Asia, and comes forward as history, that we're linked to this.
Right.
And you made a very big point about that over and over again, even with the celebrations that occur there, that I find that to be quite unique to the Vietnamese in much of Southeast Asia, being able to go back that far and being able to connect that far to today. It's like,
Yeah.
that's mostly a comment. It's not a.
No, I totally agree. And I think it's something that it shows us the importance, but it also tells us something about the people. What's the motivation for that? And for me, you know, I have political science in my background as well, and I think about these things. To me, it's these moments of independence, of new independence or of autonomy, right? When we think about everything that's happened in Vietnamese history within the last 1,000 years, within the last century, within the last few decades, that op-ed in the New York Times spelled it out, right? We've been living in the shadow of a giant neighbor. But it wasn't just the Chinese, right? We can talk about the French, we can talk about the Japanese, we can talk about conflict with other countries. And I think when that happens, people look for a way to inspire, to build ties, to build identity between groups, to unify. And one of the easy mechanisms to do that is to point to a shared ancestry. And what can we see in the past that can link all of us together? You know, the analogy with Rome, for instance, the French view the Gauls as their ancestors, even though we don't know how much of a thread of connection actually connects everybody from 2,000 years ago right through to modern day French people today. But that's the same kind of search for that past. In Korea, the same thing happens when people talk about Dangun, for instance, the mythical founder of the Korean people. And it's interesting to me that North Korean archaeologists claim to have found not only his tomb, but his remains, and they dated the remains and said, well, this is Dangun, and his remains are right outside of Pyongyang, the modern capital of North Korea. Is that valid, or is that something of a political ploy? I don't know.
For me, it's going to be a really interesting thing if they ever figure out what the language of the Dung Sun people were. And it turns out not to have been Vietnamese.
Sure. People are reconstructing that, and I know scholars that are hard at work trying to marry archaeology and history and linguistics, and it's maybe increasingly genetics. It's fascinating.
So I have a question following up on the language aspect. The present day Vietnamese, of course, is Romanized, and it was Romanized by the French, right?
Yes.
So they are happy to have it Romanized rather than have it Sionized as it once was, right?
I can't speak to that, but I presume that could be the case for many people, sure.
Because they have their own language then.
Yeah.
So at least, you know, it's different than if it was in the Chinese characters.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting to think about. I've never asked colleagues about that, or even my relatives, about how they feel about the use of different scripts and what that says about, you know, these foreign entities that were in this sort of orbit of Vietnam. But that's an interesting point. I suspect for many people that would be the case, that perhaps that's a more palatable use of a foreign script. Of course, we know all around the Sinitic world, in the Korean Peninsula and the Japanese islands, the adoption of Sinitic script for writing purposes. And of course, in Korea, in the Korean Peninsula, they then gravitated to their own alphabet and so forth. But the Vietnamese then start using this Romanized.
Well, for those of us who do Southeast Asia, just focusing on Southeast Asia, of course, Vietnamese, the language is distinctive, right? Bahasa languages and Filipino languages have their own version of, yeah, they're similar. And the Thai languages are similar. But Vietnamese is by itself, right? So it has its own distinct character, let's call it.
We can also conclude that there are no indigenous Southeast Asian languages that are written in a script that was developed in Southeast Asia.
Right.
So everybody is using a script that came
Right.
from somewhere else.
So where's our PhD student working on that?
We need them.
I was just going to say, it looks like we have one last question, time for from Amelia. Amelia, did you want to ask directly, or I can read your question in the chat as well? Okay, I will read it out. It says, are there any inscriptions in Co Loa?
The simple answer is no. Not well, depending on what time period we're talking about. The period of interest for me, right? So this is the emergence of the settlement. There's a massive city. We don't have inscriptions, but interestingly enough, the bronze drum that I showed, the one that was found by farmers back in the 1980s, there are Sinitic characters. And we don't know if they were imprinted later, but there were coins as well as characters. And some suspect that perhaps they were deposited in that drum. And maybe that drum was then put into the ground to hide, potentially, in the face of invaders. There are caches around the Co Loa site that people suspect wealth was being buried when folks knew that the writing was on the wall. Invading forces were coming, right? We don't have evidence of big battles having taken place. We don't have skeletal remains with embedded points and fractures. We don't have that kind of evidence. So we don't know if some of the legendary accounts about invasions and takeovers and military battles took place. But we see things like that, and we have indications that perhaps some of those events were happening. But that would be, from what I remember and from what I know, that would be the only kinds of inscriptions that come close in terms of chronology, the time period of interest. Of course, there's writing later, because people have been living there continuously. But that's, I hope it answers your question. From the time period, that's about it.
Great. Well, I think we can wrap things up. It's 4:30, so thanks so much for staying a bit past the time to do this great Q&A. It was a great lecture to finish off the SEASSI lecture series. So thank you so much for coming out and speaking with all of us today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for sticking around, everybody.